Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 13th of June of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. But before we start discussing the situation on the ground, I would like to start with the United States of America. And today we got at least two very important updates that are related to the situation with Ukraine. And the first one is that according to the Wall Street Journal, the US set to approve depleted uranium tank rounds for Ukraine. And I'll remind you that the United States of America is going to become the second country who is going to supply and support Ukraine with this type of weapon. The first country was or is the United Kingdom. Also, a little bit later today, the United States of America published another list of another military aid to Ukraine, and thanks God, according to this list, there are no the uranium depleted shells are not mentioned in this list, but anyway, United States of America is going to supply Ukraine with 15 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, with 10 Strykers armored personnel carriers, with javelins, with missiles, the SAMS missiles, air defense missiles, with a lot of different type of weapon for the Ukrainians. And this is also a very big aid, another military aid to Ukraine. From the other side of the world, the president of Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, had a meeting with the military bloggers who are currently were located on the ground and published, and most of these bloggers, I believe you are following, watching his news, their news and their updates, and he was talking with them, and he gave a lot of interesting piece of information for us. And the most important one is that Vladimir Putin was very surprised that soldiers were not paid 1,000 rubles. It's a little bit more than $1,000 for a destroyed tank and around $4,000 for a destroyed plane. Furthermore, he added that more than 150,000 soldiers, Russian people, entered the contract service, and 10,000 just in May. Furthermore, he added that the Russians don't have any plans for a new wave of mobilizations, and the most important from all those updates, he talked about the losses, that the ratio of losses between Ukrainians and the Russians is 1 to 10 in Russian favor, that Ukrainians lost up to 30% of armored vehicles supplied from the Western countries. That's a lot. But the most important, according to my understanding, if you ask me, the most important piece of news is that the Russians, currently the military authorities of Russian Federations, consider to create a buffer zone on the northern part of Ukraine. And he was saying that this decision and these discussions are connected with active shelling and bombing the Belgorod and the settlements on the border with Russia from the Ukrainian side. So probably, and we discussed this today in the today's stream for the patriots, that probably the Russians will create a buffer zone in this area, trying to push the Ukrainians as far as possible. And we discussed the situation about Belgorod, and we discussed that probably the Russians will use for those purposes Wagner forces and Prigozhin. For these purposes, we have already redeployed Prigozhin to this area. Furthermore, I believe that now we can move the entire Wagner forces to Belgorod, because probably this is going to be the main forces who will attack and who will create a buffer zone. And another interesting update is that the special unit Akhmat, after few attempts to capture Marinka, will be redeployed in direction of Belgorod as well. And furthermore, and today the Russians published the video of a big convoys in Belgorod area, showing that this is not the process that will take place in Belgorod. This is already a finished process, and the Russian forces like Special Unit Akhmat and Wagner's have already been redeployed to Belgorod. So I expect that within the next few days, maybe hours or maybe weeks, the Russians will start the clearing operation of the northern area of Kharkiv, and they will push the Ukrainians from this territory, and they will create a buffer zone. The interesting thing about this is that this operation will be implemented not by the Russian regular army, but with the stormtroopers, because either the Special Unit Akhmat and Wagner's are stormtroopers, and probably the Russians are planning not just to create a buffer zone, probably there is a very low chance, but there is, that the Russians will try to capture Kharkiv with these stormtroopers. It's my opinion. Now let's move to the main area. Let's move to the Vremyevka tactical bridgehead. Let's talk about Orekhov operation and so on. The Russians reported that there were no clashes, no active events from both sides on Orekhov tactical Orekhov bridgehead or on the Bradley Square. The situation is stable, is calm. I'm not saying that nobody is going to attack. Probably the Ukrainians continue regrouping up, and probably they will launch offensive operation even tomorrow, because during the previous few days there was rainy weather and it was very difficult to use vehicles to start any offensive operation. But the situation was so stable and so calm on these front lines, so the Russians were able finally to get the destroyed vehicles. If you remember, a few days ago during the offensive operation from the Ukrainian side, they got into artillery back, and 47th Brigade got into artillery back and lost almost the squad and probably the entire platoon or even company of Ukrainian forces, armored forces. There is, on this video you can see Bradleys and you can see Leopards that were captured by the Russians during this situation. And as you can see, the situation is so calm and stable that the Russians were able to get to the combat line and to inspect those armored vehicles. From the other side, the Ukrainians published the video how they were evacuating another tank, another Leopard tank, probably to some service center. So not every single tank that during the previous counter-offensive operation was destroyed or captured by the Russians. According to Vladimir Putin, just 30%, the losses just about 30%, and most of the vehicles the Ukrainians will be able to restore. And currently on this video you can see how the Ukrainians are doing this situation, trying to evacuate and restore the Western weapon. One more time, I'll remind you that during the previous days of offensive operation, the Ukrainians managed to kill, using the missile attack, the head of 35th Russian army, General Garachev. During the previous night, the Russians made a massive missile attack in Dnipro region. There were a lot of explosions, and the Russians are saying that there were maybe 5 or 6 explosions in Dnipro. Probably the Russians were attacking the Ukrainians' ammo depots, accumulation of forces, railroad stations, and so on. From the other side, the Ukrainians published there another statistic that as a result of air defense, they managed to shut down 11 missiles, X-101 and X-555, and 1 drone Shahed. It's up to you to believe or not these numbers, but I believe that it's very interesting to compare different pieces of news from both sides, from the Russians and from the Ukrainians one. Furthermore, the Russians reported that no matter that the situation was stable, they continue supporting their forces on the combat line using helicopters. To tell the truth, if you ask me, I'll tell you that the battle for Orekhov, the Russians won that battle not because of there were a lot of factors, but the most important ones is the minefields and of course the work of Russian aviation and Russian helicopters. For example, on this video you can see how the Russians using a Ka-52 helicopters destroyed another armored vehicle of the Ukrainians who were trying to establish their position somewhere in the fields among the endless Donbass or among the endless Zaporozhye area. Now we are moving to the Vremyevka tactical bridgehead. After the night's clashes in the vicinity of Makarovka, the situation hasn't been changed. The Ukrainian sources claims that they established entire control over this settlement, not just over the northern part of this area. The Russians are saying that they control the south part of this settlement. During the day, the Russians managed to repel attacks in direction of Rovnopol from Novodarivka. The Russians managed, according to their information, to repel 3 attacks in direction of Makarovka. During the day we got very interesting update that Ukrainians made another offensive operation in direction of Staromayorska, but later nobody confirmed that piece of information. The Ministry of Defense reported that during the heaviest clashes on this front line during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost 275 soldiers, 27 armored vehicles or infantry armored personal carriers, including 4 tanks and 1 artillery system Stab B. But as you can see, no matter what the Russians are saying and the Ukrainians are saying, we see that the front line hasn't been changed since the previous night. Probably this night the Ukrainians will launch another offensive operation, another attack, trying to push the Russians from this bridgehead. In the previous video we discussed the Russians, how the Ukrainians completed their regrouping, which forces are currently are located in this area, and so on. Furthermore, the Russians, Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, published another video how they were repelling the Ukrainians, attack from the trenches, from the forest lines. On this video you can see how 2 Russian soldiers using just the regular pods destroyed 2 armored vehicles in the vicinity of this forest defense belt. And of course, to compare the costs and prices that the Russians spent in the Ukrainians, of course it's incomparable. The Ukrainians lost at least 2 armored vehicles and probably 2 Bradleys or even 2 tanks. On the next part of this video we're gonna see how the Russians discovered and attacked the Ukrainian convoys in the vicinity of Prichistovka. As a result of that targeted attack, the Ukrainians lost few armored personal carriers or even tanks. So as you can see, the losses are still heavy, but without any changes on the ground. I don't know why. Probably the Ukrainians finished regrouping as well, and as we discussed, they will continue attacking. They will continue trying to develop their bridgehead in this area. And right before I start making this video, the Ukrainians published another video of another convoy, probably in the vicinity of Velika Novoselovka. As you can see, the convoy seems to me is endless. Mainly these convoys consist of tanks and armored vehicles and armored personal carriers, and probably the Ukrainians have already completed the preparation before another push, another rush somewhere in Zaporozhye, probably on the Vremyevka tactical bridgehead. So we'll see, and we need to expect more updates this night of the local time. During the day we got a very interesting update from the Russian side, and the Russians reported that they launched a counter-offensive operation on the Ugledar area. Probably the Russians were attacking the Ukrainians in the vicinity of Prichistovka. You know that, and they were using the helicopters and Su-25 airplanes to do that, to support their offensive forces. You know that during the previous days we got a lot of updates, we got a lot of useful information, but you need to understand that the size, either the Russians and the Ukrainians got a lot of very interesting updates during these days. They were analyzing that updates those pieces of information, and probably the Russians found out a very interesting thing, that the Ukrainians, one of the Ukrainians road that they're using to attack the Russian positions goes through Novoukrainka, Prichistovka, Zolota Niva, and then in direction of Novodonetsk. This is one attack supply road, and the second one in direction of the same area, but in direction of Novomayorsk. In the wrong direction, sorry. Novomayorsk direction is the second area that Ukrainians are trying to attack. And currently, as I understand, the Russians have already created a plan to attack the Ukrainians in this area in their flank, and with one purpose: to cut or at least to reduce the Ukrainians' flexibility in this area. So probably we are going to see a small counter-offensive operation from the Russian side. We have already discussed 2 options. The first one is to try to encircle the Ukrainian positions in Blagodatная Makarovka and to create a cauldron. At least the Russians have everything to complete this operation. And the second one is to attack in direction of Prichistovka, because if you remember, before the Ukrainians made all this regrouping, the 68th Jager Brigade was located exactly in Prichistovka, and probably the Ukrainians were forced to reduce the power and defense possibilities of this area by regrouping, by sending squads of 68th Brigade. And currently the Russians do have significant possibility to attack the Ukrainians in their flank exact in this area. And today's video confirms this theory. So let's let's wait a little bit and we will see whether the Russians are going to do this or not. When talking about Donetsk and Avdiivka front line, we haven't received any updates from the Russian Ministry of Defense. Probably after fierce fightings in this area, the Ukrainians and the Russians took a decision to make a small operational pause. Furthermore, one more time, the special unit Akhmat was redeployed after a few weeks of unsuccessful attempts to complete the storming of Maninka. The Ministry of Defense took a decision to redeploy these forces to the north in direction of Belgrade, and I believe that together with Wagner's they will create a buffer zone, as we discussed in the beginning of this video. Now let's talk about Artyomovsk. The Ukrainians made few attempts to attack the Russians, and mainly they were focused in Klishchiivka area. They made few attacks trying to penetrate the Russians' defense orders, but all those attacks were repelled by the Russians. The Ukrainians mainly were using the forces of 24th Mechanized Brigade and 5th and 3rd Assault Brigades. All those attacks were repelled, and the Ukrainians during those attacks lost around 350 soldiers and 8 armored vehicles. Also, the Russians published another video of another failed attempt from the Ukrainian side to develop their attack in direction of probably Berkhovka. As you can see, the Ukrainians were using tanks. They got into fields, and then on the fields they got on the minefields. The Russians were using drones, Krasnopol shells, and as a result of that massacre, the Ukraine lost another number of soldiers and armored vehicles in this area. Now we are moving further, and we got another confirmation of the Ukrainian successful positions in the vicinity of Bilogorovka. We discussed that this small industrial area is under Ukraine control, and today the Russians published another video of fightings in the vicinity of this landfill. First, the Russians attacked the Ukrainians' fortifications, trenches. Later, the Ukrainians sent evacuation squad, probably to evacuate the wounded soldiers from that fortification. And the Russians started massive bombing and shelling this territory. But as I understand, when talking about this front line, the Russians don't have such missile shells like Krasnopol. As you can see, there was uncontrolled shells on the fields, a lot of smoke, and probably the Ukrainians managed to complete evacuation and to move their infantry from this bridgehead and evacuate soldiers from this area. So as we can see, Bilogorovka and the vicinity of these hills still remains under Ukrainian control. When talking about updates about Liman on Kupyansk front line, we haven't received any interesting information. The regular clashes, regular situation, the total losses of the Ukrainians were around 95 soldiers based on the Ministry of Defense. As you can see, the level is the lowest since the beginning of the entire clashes in this area, and no changes on the ground as well. The Ministry of Defense, the Russian sources published that during the day the Ukrainians made another massive missile attack using Storm Shadow missiles against upon the Lugansk, and probably they were trying to get or hit the forces, Wagner forces, because as we discussed recently, this area became main base of Wagner's, but recently Wagner's were redeployed to Belgorod area, and I believe we need to expect about more updates from the Belgorod region, because currently this is the perfect situation for the Russians to stretch the Ukrainian forces in time when they have lack of forces, lack of armored vehicles, and lack of everything. And I believe that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.